So welcome everyone to this special live session presented as part of WWF's Climate Business Network. In this call, we'll be discussing the importance of nature in fighting climate change, and we'll be doing so with a business context. Just a quick note, we won't be talking about offsets, carbon credits, or deforestation in this session. We do appreciate that they are linked to the scope, they are linked to this topic, but due to the scope and complexity of it, we're just going to focus on the broader theme of nature at the moment. This gives us an opportunity to keep things focused and highlight the great work being done by our specialists at WWF. We do have plans for a separate event in July that focuses specifically on deforestation, and we will share that on our social media channels closer to the date. Now, today we'll be hearing from Shirley Matheson, who is our NDC Enhancement Coordinator and co-author of the Secret Ally Report, and Jean-Luc Boran, a business advocacy specialist working particularly with the finance sector. We have a questions and answer section at the end of the box, and you'll see it on your screen. So please feel free to add any questions you have. We also have team members who will be trying to answer these questions live in real time. Now, before we kick off with the main event, I would like to introduce the Climate Business Network. This is the group that's hosting this event today. This is a voluntary corporate network that aims to boost our members' companies' ability to take action and achieve their targets. This is a part of WWF. We work with our corporate partners across many different countries to achieve these goals. We provide partners with best practices on emission reduction strategies, give access to WWF experts, and help with networking and knowledge sharing with our corporate peers. We also publish guidance on key topics of sustainability, engage at big events, share some case studies, and host these special webinars to help raise awareness on some of the most important problems facing our planet. If you'd like to learn more about us, please reach out to myself. We will also share our contact details throughout the presentation and again in our wrap-up email later on. Now, I will pass things on to Shirley to talk about our Climate Secret Ally.
Thanks, Sean. I'm assuming you can all see and hear me. Nice to see everybody here. Like Sean said, I'm here to talk about some recent work that WWF did called Our Climate Secret Ally. What I will do today is, maybe some of you joined one of the previous sessions, which was going over what came out of the latest report from the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is going to be similar, but focusing on the relationship between climate and nature. So really talking about the science behind some of the asks that we have at WWF and that we're hoping would be of interest to you as well. Jean-Luc will come in later and speak something more specific to the business context, but hopefully this will also be of interest. So what I'm talking about today is this piece of work that we commissioned sort of last year. And what we were doing was reflecting on the latest science that was coming out on climate change and saying, okay, what does this tell us about the relationship between climate and nature? And it comes as no surprise that this is a bread and butter topic for WWF, but what we were interested in was the science that was coming out of the IPCC and the science which was going to inform on these discussions on climate change within the context of the Paris Agreement. So that's what we did here. If we go on to the next slide. So I'm not going to spend much on this, but like I said, in one of the previous sessions recently, there was a recap on the latest science coming out and the synthesis on a more broad level. This reflected these reports here. So what did this, what is it the recent science says about climate change, and synthesizing that into a manageable amount for policymakers. Our work was similar, but we were looking really much at the relationship between climate and nature. So very much a sort of more specialized examination. Before we move on, just very quickly on the key takeaways from these reports. So maybe you've heard this already. Our planet's already warmed by an average of about 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And I'm sure you've heard about the 1.5 threshold and how this is very important. So each of the last 4 decades, what we've seen is that we're breaking records in terms of warming temperatures. So as we move on from one decade to another, we're seeing, the increasing temperatures more and more, which is very concerning to us working in the climate side. But as you'll see from, the last report here on 1.5, there's a lot of information out there on why it's really important that we do continue to make all efforts to limit to the 1.5 degree threshold because of the impacts that this implies. And lastly, the message that really comes clear on the policy side is that progress in the next 7 years is really important. So everything we can do up to 2030 is going to make a huge difference. And that's also important on the nature side, which we'll see. So if we go on to the next slide, and here we're just going to be talking about climate and nature. And so what we did was look at the IPCC reports and develop the story around climate and nature. This we know ourselves as WWF is challenging because there's so much interconnectedness between climate and nature that when you form these messages, it's very difficult to distill them. Overall, we think that they did a really good job, and we reflected that in our work. And what we had here, what I'm showing here are the kind of 5 key takeaways, which really summarizes, on the high level, how climate and nature interact with each other based on these findings. You'll see that the theme we've got here is this idea that nature has been our ally. And I think this runs through the work that we've done, because it's very clear that we're being supported by nature in ways that we didn't necessarily recognize before. And it's important that we do recognize this and support it. So quickly going through these. So the first one, nature is our ally with regards to mitigation, climate mitigation. Nature is our ally for adaptation and for resilience. And so this is really understanding how important the natural system has been for us in addressing climate change. The core example here is that land and ocean sinks have been consistently absorbing man-made greenhouse gas emissions. You'll see in the next slide, we talk about 54% of man-made greenhouse gas emissions have been absorbed by these land and ocean sinks. And what this essentially means is that these natural systems are giving us a discount on climate change. So over 50% of climate change or the greenhouse gas emissions and then the resulting impacts are really, being prevented by the service that nature provides. And I think this is a really good way of expressing how important nature is in our fight against climate change. And then thirdly here, looking to the risks, we're losing nature as an ally. So natural systems themselves intrinsically have a limit. We can push them so far, but then they're really going to stop working for us. And that comes out very clearly in the science. Thinking about, the example that I provided here, we get, a 50% discount currently, but something that they do recognize in the science is that as we continue to break these records decade on decade with regards to the volume of greenhouse gas emissions, there's going to be sort of, this increasing saturation in these land and ocean sinks. So we're going to lose this, service provided by nature over time. And then next, that we really have to think of the fact that people and nature must continue to be allies in order to make the threshold for 1.5. And this is really pushing the message. It's clear, kind of looking across the board on what they present, that nature is not something that's a nice to have. It's something that we really need. I mean, where would we be if we didn't have this 50% discount so far? So it's really impossible for us to think about meeting the Paris Agreement goals if we don't think about the role of nature and really kind of think about how to maintain that. And lastly, the evidence suggests that there's cost-effective ways that we can make sure that we continue to have nature as an ally. And I think in the previous presentations talking about the reports, we would have gone into this in detail, but essentially this is thinking about, okay, how will we maintain this service? What does this look like with regard to safeguarding and restoring nature, recognizing that we've got a variety of geographies, of landscapes and of different types of ecosystems. So we need to think about this in a nuanced way, and we need to think about what's appropriate where. So it's, thinking about the complexity here. And secondly, certainly there's an aspect on safeguarding and restoring nature, but if we don't address the key driver from the climate side, we really are going to be fighting a losing battle. So the decarbonization side from the perspective of nature is also really important. So if we go on to the next slide, what I wanted to present here was just, this is the infographic summarizing these findings. And again, you'll see in the top right, we have this, highlighting this idea that 54% of emissions are absorbed by nature. And this is really broken up into land sinks and ocean sinks. So just to, as additional information here, 31% are absorbed by land ecosystems and 23% by ocean-based ecosystems. So we really have, all hands on deck with regards to this. I wanted to just, before we move on, talk about some of the important concepts that did come out from the perspective of nature, which are important to consider from when we think about what the future might look like. So for example, the science really shows that we have to be careful about how far we're pushing some of these sort of landscapes. And it goes back again to, how far are we going with regards to warming? There's this idea of irreversibility. That's a really big risk. We can push, nature so far, but at some point we might end up losing it in various ways. One example of this is just very simply species extinction. And they do talk about the fact that, they are seeing evidence, more and more evidence of species which are being eradicated essentially by climate change and climate change impacts. And they give a couple of examples in the report there. Secondly, and sort of related to this is this idea of tipping points. So not just looking on the species level, but on an ecosystem level, we can sort of drive threats to ecosystems to the point where we see a very abrupt change in the equilibrium, and maybe is a good way of thinking about it, of these ecosystems. It's called tipping points, where we see a large change in the way that the ecosystem is performing. So for example, one of the examples I picked up on this is that, we were getting this 54% across the board, but if we see like a massive shift, for example, in the Amazon or these big ecosystems, that might abruptly change. And this is closely related to the idea of overshoot, which is another sort of scientific area that they talk about. Maybe we're in, they talk about we will maybe have to exceed 1.5 temporarily and come back to 1.5 as, at some point before the end of the century. So this is this idea of temporary overshoot. So maintaining the global average to around 1.5, but temporarily going a bit over. That is concerning because, there's still damages that will happen as we sort of exceed, and there's still sort of impacts that will happen. So one of the examples I thought was fairly stark was, what we will see is, increasing heat waves or increasing frequency of heat waves and extremes as we go into this overshoot. And they talk about one example of during a heat wave in 2014 in Australia, 45% of over 45,000 flying foxes, died because of heat exhaustion. So we're seeing these mortality events as an example. And lastly, before we move on, there's another concept of this idea of cascading impacts. So we have these impacts, and I've given a few examples of species and ecosystems, but it doesn't stop there. There's these knock-on effects that we need to recognize. So for example, if we see the complete removal of pollinators, this could reduce the global fruit supply by 23%. It could reduce vegetables by 16% and nuts and seeds by 22%. And if you think of kind of what type of cascading impacts will we see there, with regards to things like food availability, food security, for nature and for people. So that's another important concept that came out related to the sort of nature story. So what I wanted to do with the rest of my time was to step out a little bit from the research and just put it in a bit of context on what we're talking about. So if we go on to the next slide, what I wanted to do was just highlight some examples of what we mean when we're talking about, these type of allies. So I chose this photograph because I'm Scottish, and this is a picture of a peatland in Scotland. It's not always the most beautiful landscape to look at, but from a climate perspective, they're very important. So peatlands, they only account for around about 3% of global land area. And remember, I was talking about how much land sinks sort of absorb. These type of ecosystems can store around about, and altogether can store around about 600 billion tons of carbon. And to put that in context, if the previous slide, the infographic was talking about how our 2019 emissions were around about 60 billion tons. So 3% of the global land area can offer us over 100% of 2019 carbon emissions as a storage service. So they're really important, even though they're not necessarily, the most beautiful landscapes. And so we have to be careful on sort of how we treat them. If you have degraded peatlands, if you re-wet them, that's a really powerful activity and immediately stopping the loss of carbon sinks that have been stored here. And similarly, preventing conversion of these type of landscapes, for example, to forests, if we planted forests all over this type of landscape and converted it, that itself would potentially lead to a loss of carbon. So that's, again, talking about how we have to think about this, the complexity of putting the right activities in the right areas. If we move on to the next slide. So I wanted to talk about resilience and adaptation and what that means from the perspective of nature. What I chose here was a photograph of the coastal region of Madagascar, and this is a WWF mangrove plantation, which was working with the community to sort of increase the coastal mangrove population. And you'll see here it's in the very, very early stages. But there's so many kind of important services you get from these type of ecosystems. So if you have mangroves or coastal ecosystems like this, they can provide natural seawalls. So I've seen some memes around about this that really show the way that this works on the scientific level. They help reduce the threats associated with rising sea levels for storms, for swells. Because they can break up, having, grown mangroves can break this up before it reaches the shore. It can make sure, to break it up and, distill the energy before it necessarily reaches populations. And as these ecosystems become healthy, the ground and the soil that they're in become healthier and porous in the right way, and the fact that if you have intense rainfall, then it can be really helpful in sort of absorbing this rather than having it sit on top. So it can be really helpful in increasing the water cycle. So that's just an example there. And if you think about also, one of the things that this project talked about or really supported was the livelihoods of people living in the area and linking these. So providing these ecosystems which would create sort of fishery habitats for crab and shrimp. So that's this example of nature-based solutions that WWF talks about. So that's a good example there. If we go to the next slide. What I wanted to do here was to show, two of the really important ecosystems are tropical forests and Arctic permafrosts, because they contain the highest carbon stocks on above ground vegetation. So very important from a carbon perspective. And partly I wanted to include the one on the right because, what is a permafrost? And this is what it looks like. This is a thawing permafrost in Alaska, and you can see at the top there's what they call this active layer of soil, which is actively absorbing carbon, and underneath it you have the stores that are there. So that's what we're talking about, maintaining this and maintaining the health of these ecosystems. And on the left here, we have a close-up of harvested tropical rainforest logs. So sort of an example of deforestation there. And this is really, I wanted to talk about how we are potentially putting the services of nature at risk by allowing sort of degradation on this side. So we're not just talking about climate change as a risk, we're talking about all aspects of risks to these natural systems. And that's also highlighted within the science that we're talking about here. So focusing on the forest side of things, deforestation, really alters the climate, particularly in these kind of tropical rainforests. So it can alter rainfall cycles, it can create drier climates. So again, if you think about this idea of cascading impacts, to this area. It's a fairly big threat if we don't manage or understand this system properly. And it's deforestation is a big risk to these climate sinks. Deforestation itself accounts for 45% of total land use emissions if we include agriculture. So that's a really significant amount of emissions coming purely from deforestation. So this is why this is one of the hot topics for WWF, maybe to put that in context. And I wanted to go on, I think I have one more slide, because I wanted to talk a little bit about oceans and the differences between the land and the oceans. So like I said, oceans take up and store around about 23% of man-made greenhouse gas emissions. And this is, within the ocean absorbing these emissions, but, ecosystems that are within the ocean and as well as sort of species, so kelp, seagrass, sandbanks, these type of biomes all store carbon to different degrees, and some of these really kind of to high efficiency. So really kind of great tools for us. But the ocean itself, as it absorbs greenhouse gas emissions, there's risk to its composition. This is a little bit different from the way that land systems work. And so maybe you've heard about us talk about ocean acidification and these type of risks. So that's something we need to take into account. Also, the ocean provides an additional service in absorbing excess heat. So it's absorbing man-made greenhouse gas emissions, but it's also absorbing more than 90% of the excess heat that we have in the climate. So that's an additional sort of secret service, so to speak, and helping us limit climate change, or the climate change impacts that reach us. But yeah, so what I'm showing here is these, they're called sea butterflies, these little kind of really small kind of like creatures in the ocean. And one of the reasons that I wanted to show these was, again, turning to this idea of ocean acidification. So the problem with ocean acidification and why we're concerned about this is because it can really affect the oxygen levels, the salinity in the ocean, and this has a knock-on effect. So the one example here is the fact that these sea butterflies or oysters, mussels, it makes them difficult to sort of create and maintain their skeletal systems, their shell systems, whatever they need as a habitat, as well as kind of on, the organisms themselves. And as the acidity increases, that can actually cause a risk to these organisms, and they, can begin to dissolve themselves. So before this presentation, I was looking at a research piece which was showing that if you put a shell within seawater, which is adjusted to the salinity that could happen by 2100, you actually see that disappear within 45 days. So that's why these type of impacts are concerning. So I wanted to finish there with regards to some of the examples, but just end quickly with, the practicalities. So if we go on to the next slide, two of the key takeaways on the high level from the sixth assessment report and from the perspective of climate and nature, and I talked about at the beginning, is what can we do about this with regards to safeguarding and maintaining nature and getting rid of the source of emissions. So firstly, we need to recognize kind of the nature that we have and make sure that they were properly safeguarding it. So at the high level, they've been very clear that there's a need for us to safeguard, to conserve approximately 30 to 50% of land, freshwater and ocean areas. And hopefully from what I presented, it's quite clear the complexity around this. So it's about effective and equitable conservation and exploring that. Secondly, so on my last slide, there is recognizing that we need to address the drivers of climate change, because that in itself is compromising nature and the service it provides to us. So what I chose here is just a summary sentence from the synthesis report talking about what emissions we really need to be seeing on a global scale by 2030, by 2035, and by 2050. And this is really recognizing that we need to be results focused. It's not I mean, the activities are going to be what get us there, but we really need to be demonstrating this. And I think that's one of the things that's come out of the report now, is that actions are happening, and some of the results, we're getting some results from this, but they are not meeting these targets. So that's why actors like WWF are still pushing for more ambition. So I'll stop there. My last slide was just really to provide you with some contact details, and maybe we can put a link to our key report on this in the chat, and you can have a look at some of the more detailed outcomes. But I'm happy to answer any questions as much as I can. So I think next I will be moving on to Jean-Luc. So I will pass over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Charlie. Right. So I'm going to talk today on nature and transition plans, why and how, a vast subject. And I suggest we start with the basics. So could you go to the next slide, please? So what is a transition plan? Transition plans are time-bound, comprehensive action plans that describe how a company intends to reduce its carbon emissions and climate risk in line with national and international targets, like those of the Paris Agreement. As you can see, the definition has a clear focus on actions. Action is a key word indeed. A credible transition plan is driven by concrete action and science-based target. It is not, by all means, disclosure for the sake of disclosure or ticking boxes. Transition plans currently are also very much centered on climate, and more specifically about developing your pathway to an early and orderly world of economic climate transitions. In other words, this is not about simple decarbonization, and it is not about nature. GFANZ, or the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero for financial institutions globally, and the TPT, or Transition Plan Task Force for Real Economy and Financial Institutions in the UK, have published transition plan frameworks, which are by design pretty much aligned. So if we go to the next slide, here you will see the very high level overview of the TPT framework as an example. So a credible transition plan starts with presenting its ambitions, what we call the foundations. So basically describing the end goals, the high-level strategy, and impact on business model. From these foundations, then the plan develops an implementation strategy and an engagement strategy. The implementation strategy states in particular a clear roadmap on short, medium, long-term actions on clearly defined levels. Here, I want to emphasize short-term actions because they are key considering the state of urgency we stand now. So it's very important to have short-term actions. The engagement strategy is also very important because no one can reach net zero alone. So it is very important to engage with your value chain, your peers, the governments, etc. Finally, all those actions needs to be tested against quantitative metrics and targets. Again, short-term targets are key, but also it is imperative to ensure all targets and metrics are actually anchored with science. In this exercise, governance rules must be disclosed too in order to ensure clear accountability, unconditional buy-in from your board in particular, and measures to change your internal culture and develop appropriate skills. Next slide, please. So you are going to tell me, since transition plans are all about climate, what should I consider nature? Well, the answer is simple. Climate change and nature loss are so deeply entwined, we cannot solve one without solving the other. So we see four main reasons why nature should be included in a transition plan. First, nature loss and climate change drive each other. Just look at the forest, land, and agriculture sector, which contribute to 23% of global emissions, partly from deforestation, a key driver from biodiversity loss. Second, omitting nature from climate mitigation actions may lead to unintended consequences. For example, renewable energy resources are often mined in key biodiversity areas. We can also convert diverse native vegetation to monoculture of species that only grow in a narrow climatic envelope and lead in that way to failed mitigation because climate change makes the area improper for such vegetation. Third, nature is a significant carbon sink, and I'm not going to talk more on that since Shirley gave a very good view on that. Fourth, healthy ecosystems are more resilient. For example, nature restoration provides cheaper and very often more efficient alternative to expensive climate infrastructures against flooding, storms, and erosion. Biodiversity also ensure we maintain a diverse DNA capital that could one day, for example, contribute to create drought-resistant crops. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So now, okay, fine. Nature is important, but how can we include it in a transition plan? So we propose a two-step approach. In step one, we think it's important to consider nature under the optic of your climate actions to support the delivery of the Paris Agreement. In other words, you have to understand how your climate actions impact, depend on, or are exposed to risk and opportunities from nature. By the way, here I would like to emphasize that transition plans don't consider only risk. Their completions are very much driven and relying on opportunities, meaning that your business is not doomed, it can still flourish. In a step two, we would recommend to consider nature in its own right to support the nature positive goals of the CUNMIN Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework agreed at COP15 last December. What does it mean? That means that now you will have to understand how your business model and not only your climate action impacts, depends on, or exposed to risk and opportunities from nature. So to be honest, I'm pretty conscious that step two is still out of reach, and it is why I'm not going to talk about it anymore and focus on only step one. Next slide, please. So, when you integrate nature in the climate transition plan, that means that you can build on its existing framework. You don't have to create a new framework. You just need to adapt the climate transition plan. To do so, you will have to pursue your analysis one step further beyond a sole focus on climate and ask yourself additional questions in relation to possible impacts on nature or opportunities to leverage nature to reach your climate goal more efficiently. As a consequence, that means that your first action should be to reconsider your climate actions and identify where and how they intersect with nature. Your objective should then be to identify hotspots where climate and nature interdependencies are material, and from there, see how you can either reduce frictions or leverage opportunities. In this exercise, and as a first step, I would recommend you asking the following 4 questions when you review your climate actions. First, could my elected climate action exacerbate nature loss? If yes, then you should look at a larger spectrum of solutions and try to safeguard nature as much as you can. Second, are my emissions arising from nature's degradation? If yes, then prioritize action to reduce land conversion. Stopping deforestation, for example, in your value chain is an obvious win on both climate and biodiversity loss. You don't have to make big studies to understand that. Do I have high-emitting activity with significant impact on nature? If yes, then I should try to curve down my impact on nature and reduce my emissions. Finally, can I consider climate solutions leveraging nature? If you can, then try to restore carbon sink. Invest in nature-based solutions such as mangrove restorations. By answering those questions, you will include nature in your transition plan and should be able to select clear, no regret actions that you would not have considered otherwise. And by doing so, you are starting step one in the integration of nature in transition plan. So now you can prioritize your action and develop your implementation strategy. The logic here is actually not different from a climate-centered transition plan. You just have to translate your newly defined nature objectives into concrete roadmaps in the relevant business activities. Here, I would like also to emphasize the importance of performing sensitivity analysis to test the resilience of your assumptions. In a fast-changing ecosystem due to feedback loops from climate change and biodiversity loss, you have to be conservative to avoid unintended business degradations. For example, a commodity producer may be dependent on the availability of certain fish stocks to feed its livestock. So it is important to consider scenario marine ecosystem. Or certain tree species used for reforestation may not grow in more extreme temperature. Next slide, please. Your engagement strategy may have to be revised too in order to include new stakeholders. The same will apply to governments. For example, you may want to advocate to policymakers for policy changes, such as removing environmentally damaging subsidies, create markets for nature-based solutions. As nature impacts are local, specific, and quite diverse, you will probably have to define specific metrics and targets. And at a time where standards on metrics and targets are still being developed, you will have to disclose the methodology you used and clarify targets boundaries, baselines, reference years. Finally, in governments, it will be important to also describe how you plan to handle trade-offs between climate and nature, because for sure you will have to do some trade-offs. Next slide, please. So, as you can see, identifying material interdependency is a crucial step. Unfortunately, is one of the most complex and challenging. Luckily, methodology and tools are being developed and are partially available to help you now. In particular, I would like to recommend you to have a closer look on the TNFD LEAP assessment tool, the SBTN guidance on water, land use, deforestation, and emissions, the Encore tool for scoping risk and dependency from nature, and TRACE to access your exposure to tropical deforestation. One additional point I would like to make on materiality. When you look at materiality, you have to consider actually the magnitude, the irreversibility, the frequency, and the likelihood of impact. It is also important that you don't only focus on the risk for nature, on your company. You have also to consider the negative impact your own activity as a company may have on society and the environment. Don't underestimate look back impact on your enterprise value in the long term. So some frameworks like the TCFD focus on disclosure related to the financial risk to the entity, but others such as the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive requires already companies to disclose risk to the enterprise and to environment and society. Next slide, please. So including nature in transition planning is going to be a journey with a large number of iterations, I'm sure. It is clear you will have to face challenges even harder than for climate, most commonly on difficulty to assess materiality and to identify risk and opportunities in supply chain, or lack of standardized reporting methods, good quality data and metrics, and official objectives to reduce nature impact. But first movers will be better positioned to capture commercial opportunities in a world that has to review its relationship with nature. The World Economic Forum estimates nature positive solution could create over $10 trillion in business opportunity and over 100 million jobs by 2030. Holistic strategy combining climate and nature can unlock benefits, for example, on food and water security, disaster risk mitigation, improving human health outcomes. And also organizations with credible holistic transition plan are likely to reduce their physical, regulatory, market, and reputational risk, get better access to finance as natural loss is increasingly seen as a systemic risk, and maintain and create long-term value. Next slide, please. So to conclude, I would like to reiterate some message. So first, your disclosure should be guided by your action plan, not the sole obligation to disclose. Don't forget that transition must also be just. We have a moral imperative to protect indigenous rights and the most vulnerable communities. In my view, there is no excuse for inaction, even if nature frameworks are still being developed. You can start now, for example, by setting targets to eliminate activities in protected areas, to scale investment in restorative nature-based solutions, and to reduce plastic and waste pollution, for example. Also act now. We are at risk of reaching irreversible tipping points. Finally, to conclude, I can only recommend you to read our report, Nature and Transition Plan, Why and How. You will see a lot of tools and methodology being described for the various sections of the transition plan. So I'm pretty sure you will see a lot of material here to help you. Thank you very much. And now I hand over to Sean.
Thank you. Amazing, Jean-Luc. Now, we hope that was helpful and giving you some ideas of what you can do to implement nature in your emission reduction strategies. I also wanted to take this opportunity to highlight some other assets and initiatives that might be valuable in this space. This is an area where we're seeing lots of great strides forward at a government level, and we just wanted to highlight a few. So obviously, it was a big agenda item on the UN climate negotiations at COP27 and again at the UN Biodiversity COP15. We saw a recognition of the importance of nature. We've seen implementation of targets 8, 15, and a campaign with more than 600 companies in attendance and 400 plus signatories to make it a mandatory campaign. We see groups like the Rights for Nature emerging. We also see the UK government developing mandatory standards for listed companies and financial firms. And of course, EU deforestation law banning the import and range of commodities linked to deforestation. So this is definitely growing in importance and will become more and more present in your daily lives. And as a nature or conservation organization, we do welcome this extra scrutiny, but we also know there needs to be guidance that goes with it. And that's where we at WWF have some lovely assets to share with you. So on top of the 2 papers that we've already presented today, we have some others that are relevant to this topic and go into more detail on key areas. They're all available on our website, and we'll also share them with our follow-up email after this, so you can find them more easily. These are just 4 of many, but we think these are targeted quite well to this topic. I also just wanted to make a note on a key initiative to be aware of, which is the SBTN. This group builds on the successes of the SBTI, guiding companies through a 5-step process to assess, prioritize, measure, address, and track impacts on all aspects of the environment, not just those related to climate, for companies and ultimately cities as well. So the first version of the methodologies will be released next month if they stick to timeline. This will include integrated guidance for companies to assess and prioritize their material impacts on the environment and then set targets accordingly. In this first release, targets will be limited within freshwater and land with an aim to have full sets of SBTN by 2025. If you are curious about the linkages between this and SBTI's Forest, Land and Agriculture project, also known as FLAG, FLAG actually demonstrates how SBTI and SBTN can align on a target setting methodology that can contribute towards improvements for nature and climate in unison. That's a very nice segue into FLAG for us. So FLAG is the world's first standard for companies in land-intensive sectors to set science-based targets. WWF have been working across the SBTI and the SBTN to connect our forest goals with corporate target ambition, as well as aligning with other goals. This is something that you've probably seen a lot of. We have some other webinars available, again, on our social media channels and online for you. And finally, I just wanted to highlight Business for Nature. This is a global coalition of businesses and conservation organizations to demonstrate and amplify credible business voice on nature. They encourage companies to commit and act to reverse nature loss and advocate for greater policy ambition, calling for governments to adopt policies to reverse nature loss. Through their Make It Mandatory campaign, more than 400 businesses and financial institutions from 52 countries, with a combined revenue of more than $2 trillion, helped convince governments at COP15 to adopt the Global Biodiversity Framework. Now, that was a lot of information. I hope it was valuable and is very helpful for you. And I hope you are still with us as I invite our speakers back to help answer some of the questions and answers that we might have. If you haven't already, please feel free to pop some questions in the box at the bottom of your screen. Now, so Jean-Luc and Shirley. Jean-Luc, I noticed you were answering that question. It would be valuable to answer that online if we could.
I'm not sure where you're looking, Sean, but happy to talk about the trade-off between climate and nature, which I think Jean-Luc's already started.
That's a great one. If you could, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, actually, just answer. One typical trade-off would be, for example, mining resources for building the new economy on clean energy, and for example, batteries, and you will have to mine resources to solve climate. So here, there is definitely trade-offs to be made.
And I can supplement that with a slightly different, maybe similar answer. So we talk a lot on the climate side for the need for urgent and rapid transitioning, and that includes the deployment of renewable energy and the phase out of fossil fuels. And this is something that, you know, there's a lot of discussion on, okay, if we need to be deploying all of these renewable energies, where are they going to go? How are they going to do it in a way which works with nature and doesn't compromise nature? And I think there is more work on our side to be done, but it's definitely, you know, I know there's discussions, for example, on the European side on how stringent should these environmental regulations be, because we need to have renewables there. But we need to think, as I said, on the side of nature, you know, could we be compromising a really important carbon sink by putting, you know, solar panels or, you know, a wind farm all over it? So it's not a happy question, but it's the type of questions that we do have to consider, and we have to be very realistic on making sure that we're providing as much as we can the best outcome for climate and nature in those circumstances. So that's, the type of difficult questions we get. And a lot of these are very kind of specific, place-based specific questions, but something that needs to be considered.
Excellent, thank you. I see a question from Reza from Pakistan, who believes enforced actions are needed instead of voluntary actions. Time is running out. Well, I think we can all speak to this, but we do believe, yes, there's a huge, more prominent role that governments do need to be playing in enforcing these actions, but we can't wait for those actions to take place. And we are working with our policy experts to push those things forward. But for our businesses, we need them to also show these governments that they're willing and they're able to step forward and take care of these actions and be the example that we want to see. I think that answers that.
I think maybe just to supplement that, I think there's definitely an element of understanding as a community that we're in this system where governments are trying to act on our behalf. And that's not just, that's personally, but also as a business. So businesses engage with governments on this. And I think they have a really strong role in just creating those signals to governments that they want more stringent targets. They want governments to commit to these things, and they want them to provide very clear market signals which are aligned with climate change, so that the changes can happen on the business level, as well as on the kind of other kind of non-party stakeholders, various different levels. So I think again, there's different things that we can do, but I think there's also a way that we can feed in and sort of ask for more from governments and give them the signal that we're ready to sort of respond to that.
Thank you. And we have a question from Amanda Skeldon, who says, one of the challenges she's still struggling is to find a clear approach on this. The desire for investors to invest in restoring nature for carbon credits. We don't want to encourage offsetting as a priority in a net zero strategy transition plan, but we do want to encourage people to invest in the restoration and protection of natural carbon sinks. It's not particularly a question, just an ongoing challenge she wanted to flag. And if you have any questions on that, you want to follow up on.
I mean, you said you were going to have a session on this separately, Sean, so maybe it's not ideal to go kind of down that route, but I think it's definitely something to consider, and also maybe broadening the idea of what this investment can do, and not, just thinking about offsetting as one specific way to think about valuing nature, and there may be other ways to do it, and that's a challenge for like a lot of people, I think, and I guess that's what you've identified there, Amanda, and it's maybe something that we have to, co-discuss.
Absolutely. One of the things just on that point as well is we often talk, especially from a business context, we talk about nature in a very extractive way, what we can get from it for our business and how it can help us with specific problems without valuing the role of nature itself. And that's what we wanted to do in today's session, was to highlight that and give a big broader perspective. It's not just about carbon credits, it's very much about protecting the ecosystems in which we live. But yeah, wonderful. Now I see we're running out of questions to ask. If anyone else, I'll give a more prompt if anyone has any questions, or if not, we're coming up to the top of the hour anyway, so this might be perfect.
I might just spotlight quickly what Mohammed has said in the Q&A about how, he's used the example from his perspective that his end customers are from other countries, and consumption is really driving emissions, and that's also something which comes out really clearly, and that's another challenge I think that businesses can take to governments to start, to not be very kind of pigeonhole the sort of climate action at the national level, and really think about how things go across borders, with regards to trade, with regard to consumption emissions, and not just sort of localized domestic emissions. And so that's maybe another area which I think is of interest to discuss. When the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC talk about emissions and the responsibilities of parties, they're talking about domestic emissions. So that is a really interesting challenge, which I think private sector can really drive and sort of say, okay, how are we going to look across the borders, and what are the structures that need to be in place, and who should be responsible for doing that? So I think that's a really important point, and thank you for highlighting that, Mohammed.
So we have an anonymous comment just saying some companies are already sending positive signals out, challenging their carbon finance, channeling it, then get unfairly scrutinized by media and other relevant stakeholders, which is actually slowing action. If we want policies, if we wait for policies and regulations to speed up, we will need a second parliament. I don't necessarily agree with that form of pessimism, but yeah, we are seeing some amazing companies doing some really wonderful action. I don't think scrutiny is a bad thing. I think all scrutiny can be justified and can be fair. We've seen a lot of greenwashing and we've seen a lot of mistrust built by companies in this. So that's why we ask for the right certification and the right methodologies to make sure that when scrutinized, we can show these positive examples and really make them stand up against the rest.
And I would also say that certainly media is a really powerful influence, but the level of education at the general level on climate change is it's really growing. It's very impressive, speaking as someone who engages the public on climate change. So I mean, I think that's maybe a question I would say is that why is media scrutiny slowing these things down? I mean, I think definitely people recognize when, you know, good actions are being done, and they recognize when detrimental actions are being done, you know, and so I think certainly there's an element on pushing back on media, but also I would say looking past it is something that maybe we can try and think about supporting on.
Great. Okay, well, I just want to say we're at time. Thank you so much again for our amazing panelists, Shirley Matheson and Jean-Luc Baran, for taking part in this session. We hope it was incredibly helpful to you, and thank you again. We'll see you at the next one.